Okay, so welcome back. This is part two in our series where we show you how to work with multiple forms in C Sharp, Windows Forms, Visual Studio. And I encourage you to look at the first video in the series where we showed you basically how to set up multiple forms and start them up and show them. And in this video, we're going to take the next step. We're going to show you how to share and move data between different forms. Very, very important. Now, here's an example. I'm going to show you how we can access data from multiple forms. And what I'm going to do is I've got this form 1 here, and I've got some buttons here, and I'm going to load some data from a text file, a CSV file, and then I'm going to chart it. So I'm going to select load data from CSV, select my file, and now I'm going to click this button to show a chart of the data we just loaded. And here is a second form that I brought up. You can see we can access both of these forms now. And this second form is displaying the data that has been loaded into this first form, this form 1, into this code. So now I've got two forms and they're doing different things. So now what I might want to do is, let's say I've got this data and I want to modify it and I want to update this chart with the data that is generated in this form 1. So I'm going to hit modify, and you can see it in real time. It updates, it modifies the data in form 1 and updates the chart to show the latest version of the data. And each time I click, I can modify it. I'm basically just multiplying this sine wave that we brought in by another sine wave, and it's modifying it at each time. So as you can imagine, there is some data being transferred. We're loading it into this Form 1 software, and we are then sharing it with this Form 2 with this chart, and we're updating the data. So how do we do that? You know, what's the process we use to share data between these forms? So that's what we're going to look at in this video. So here is the basics of our application. We've got Form 1 and Form 2. And the first step is we're going to, from a file, a CSV file, we're going to load the data. And we're going to load it into this Form 1. And we're going to load it into a list of doubles. And you can imagine this waveform is a bunch of values that have a time and a value. So there's going to be two lists of double values that we're going to load from the CSV, and then somehow we're going to share those lists with this Form 2, with this chart. So we're going to transfer that data to this Form 2. So how do we do that? Now, one thing you might consider, and I'm a big fan of this with engineering applications where you've got some input data that you're going to process and analyze, or maybe you got something from a database. And what you would like to do is you would like to make that data, in our case some lists of doubles, make that data available to all aspects of the application. In our case, the different forms, or maybe the different classes, but you would like to make that data generally available. Now, you don't always want to do that. Sometimes you want to have private data that exists only in a certain part of your application. But in the engineering world, often you need to operate on a generally available data that everybody can access. And to do that, one of my first things is I generally like to set up a static class, a public static class that inside of it just has this data, these lists of doubles that we're going to plot. By doing that, you make it so that every aspect of your application, of your software application, your solution, can access this very important data and do whatever you want. You can chart it, you can manipulate it, you can analyze it. So the first thing I like to do is I generally consider using a public static class when I have data that I want everybody to have access to. Now that's one really nice option. Now there are other options. So let's say in our Form 1, I've got a list of double, and we call it X vals, and I've got another one with the Y vals. One other way that I can share the data that I brought into this Form 1, I can share it with the Form 2 so I can chart it, is to have a method. And that method would be, in the code for Form 2, I would set up a method. And for example, we could say send to form 2 is the name of the method. In that method, you can accept some values. In our case, our list of doubles. You can add that as a parameter, and then form 1 can call that method. It can say, okay, I've got my list of values and I want to plot it. So I can call in form 2 this method, send to form 2, and feed it the values that I want to chart. So I can say form 2, and here's my method. I call the method that resides in form 2, pass it whatever values I want, and then in form 2 code, it will update this chart. So that's another way to do it. And you can also have a combination. You can have a static class and then also send the data to form 2 to chart. So that's a couple ideas. You can also have events. You can set up a little bit more complicated where you have events where if you change the data in this form 1, it automatically updates this chart. That's another option, a little bit more complex. We're going to look at the simple solution right now. Now, the other thing you got to figure out is how you're going to update. So let's say I've got my list of doubles, X vals and Y vals in form 1, and let's say I modify them. How am I going to update this chart when the data is modified? And of course, there's multiple options you can use, but we'll look at a couple of them here. You can have, like we had in the introduction, where we had a button press modify. When we press that button, it calls the method that we just talked about in form 2 and sends the updated data over to form 2 for charting. So the update can be initiated by a button press and just call a method and send the data. Another thing you can do is use a timer, and timers are really nice. I use them a lot, where every second or so the timer initiates an event, and if that data has changed, the event will say, hey, if this data has changed, let's update the chart. So it updates the chart with the latest static data. So those are a couple things that you can do, and we will look at some of the options here in our code. All right, so here we are in the application we started in the previous video. I encourage you to look at that. And again, if I've done a lot of C# and programming videos on this channel. If C# is new to you, I've got a series on how to write your first C# application. So a 3-part series for beginners. And I've got a lot of other videos on this channel in engineering and science, and also talking about software development. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So here's our application, and I'm looking at form1.cs, which we talked about in the previous video. This is the default form 1 that comes up. And I've also got form2.cs, which we've added as we showed in the previous video, and that's our form 2. And then form 1 design, I've just added 3 buttons, and to load data from the text file, to show the chart, and then to modify the data and update the chart. And then form 2 design, all I've done is I've got a default form that came when we instantiated form 2, and I've drag and dropped a chart that we're going to be charting the data. So that's it. I've just got form 1, form 2, and the 2 designs. Now, we talked about that one thing I like to do when I've got data, global data that's going to be used throughout the application, is I like to set up a public static class to hold that data so that there's no problem with anybody in the application accessing the data. So what I've done is I have added, again, go to your project, right-click, add new class. I've added a class, public static class, and I called it app data. And the only thing I've got in here is 2 lists of doubles. One that holds the X values for the static class, and one that holds the Y values for the static class. So now everybody, all of the forms in my application can access this data that we want to plot and modify because it's sitting in this public static class. The way this works is, as we mentioned before, as you start the program, we go into Program CS. It runs the new Form 1, and Form 1 does the initialize component, and it just sits there and waits for you to do something. And the first thing you do is you load from CSV. So here's the event handler for the load, and all it does is it calls a method that I've added, read CSV to lists. And this is the method that I've added. It basically reads from a CSV file into those two lists in this app data, all right? And since it's a public static class, it has access to that data, no problem. So here is the code that does that. It just brings up an open file dialog. You can pause the video and copy this if you want. But basically, it goes through each line, the CSV file with the X and Y values separated by commas, converts the X and Y values to doubles, and adds them to the X values in the static class. Here's app data, which is the class. It adds the 0th element to the X values and the first element to the Y value. So it's just populating those two lists, and now we'll have access to all of them. So you've read to CSV, and the next thing you can do is you can show the chart. And this is going to show us how we can show the chart and update it with this data. So how do you do that? Well, button show chart, when you click it, it instantiates a new form 2. And again, form 2 is the chart form. So it instantiates a new form 2. And we have defined it up here in the beginning so that everybody has access to this form 2, and we're calling it chart form. So chart form is a new form 2, we're instantiated, and then as we showed in the last one, we're saying chart form.show, and that shows the form 2 chart. So when you do that, we now go to form2.cs, and what it does initialize component, and it sets up the chart. It says chart type.line, it clears the legends, and it then, chart1 series 1, points data bind XY, and it now binds the X and Y values we just read into this public static class. It binds those to the chart. So now at this point, we have shown the form 2 with the chart on it. We have bound the data to it from this public static class, so we should be seeing the updated chart. So let's run this and see what we get. So we run it, we load from CSV, we load the data, and we show chart, and there it is. We have sent the data to this form 2 chart. Now, this button, as I said, modifies this data, so let's press that and see what happens. Well, we press it, and nothing happens. So we've got the data charted, but any modifications aren't happening. So we're going to have to figure out how to update this chart with the new data that happens with this modify. So let's look at the modify, see what it's doing, and see how we can make this work. So back in the form 1, we said form 1 is where you do the modification of that data. So it's accessing this app data, X and Y, and what I'm doing here is I'm modifying it by running this for loop. And I'm going from X equals 0 to the app data xval stat count. So the count of the data that we just imported from the CSV. And all it's doing is it's taking each Y value in that data, multiplying it times a sine wave of frequency 10, and you don't have to worry about that. We're just modifying the data and coming up with a new Y vals in the static class. We're stepping through and modifying it. And then what we're doing is we're calling chart form send list from form 1 to form 2, which is saying chart form is in form 2. We're calling this method and we're sending it the X vals and the Y vals. So let's go over to form 2 and see where this method is that should be updating the chart. So here we are in form 2, and the only thing we've got is this public void send list from form 1 to form 2, and it accepts a list of doubles for the X vals and a list of doubles for the Y vals. Since the chart 1 is in this form 2, it has access to the chart 1 data, and it can data bind. But we have this commented out, which is why we're calling, but we're not actually data binding those values to the updated values. So I'm going to uncomment this, and we'll run it and see if now when I do the modify, and it calls this method if it actually data binds and updates the values. So we'll start it, load from CSV, load the data into the lists, show the chart with that data, then modify, multiply times the sine waves, and there you go. It is now calling that method with the updated value, and I hit it again, and it's updating and updating. Each time it's modifying it, multiplying times the sine wave and modifying. So another possibility, we do this modify button, and we call this chart form, we update the list. We could just, with this modify button, just do the modification but not actually update the chart, and instead in form 2 have a timer that automatically does this every time step rather than relying on this modify button to actually update the chart. There's a bunch of ways to do it. You could have events if the data is changed. Maybe we'll look at that in a future video, but that should give you an idea of how to share and move data between forms in C# Visual Studio Windows Forms. So if you like any of these videos, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.